Our second paper is about bank loan markups with adverse selection, presented by Greg Weitzner from McGill University.
Okay, can you hear me okay? Great. Okay, so thanks so much for the organizers for inviting us to present this paper. This is joint work with Mehdi Bayagi, who's at the Richmond Fed, and Cesare Fracassi, who's at UT Austin. And I'm really happy to be presenting this paper after Governor Bowman's keynote, because the central idea of this paper echoes her main thesis that this traditional view of competition we take when thinking about banks is perhaps incomplete. Let's see. Okay, so just to motivate, this is probably not surprising to any of you. If you look at this black line, this is the share of total assets held by the largest 10 bank holding companies in the United States. And in 1985, this was around 35%. And by 2015, this has risen to up over 60%. And this is something that's concerned regulators because our standard models of competition typically predict that higher market concentration leads to higher prices, making consumers worse off. And indeed, if we look at the deposit market, many studies do find this relationship. They find that higher local market concentration leads to lower deposit rates. And perhaps because of this fact, regulatory agencies, they'll use these measures of deposit HHI when approving mergers in the United States. But what we argue in this paper is that credit markets are fundamentally different than deposit markets and other product markets. And one of the main reasons for that is these are often plagued by asymmetric information. So this can be between the borrower and the lender. So the borrower may know more about their creditworthiness than the lender, but it can also be across banks. So some banks may know more about a borrower than other banks. And in fact, this second form of asymmetric information can actually cause this relationship to reverse. So it's actually possible that having more lenders in a market can actually lead to higher interest rates. And here's kind of a quote that I think somewhat captures this idea in some way. The CFO of a new bank once told the author that as soon as you open your doors, every deadbeat in town lines up to try to borrow from you. So the basic idea of this is that if I'm a bank and a borrower walks into my door, I'm going to be worried that they've already been rejected by the other banks in town. And this problem becomes exacerbated the more banks there are in the region. This can actually cause interest rates to be higher when there are more banks in that region. And so what I'm arguing is that this relationship between market concentration and prices in loan markets is actually more of an empirical question. It's theoretically ambiguous. Now, what's the problem with trying to test this? So let's say we have two loans. This is all completely made up, given by JP Morgan in Q1 of 2017. And let's say these loans, they have the exact same characteristics, like size of the loan, the borrower is exactly the same, at least from observable characteristics. One is in St. Louis County, the other is in Franklin County. In loan one is in St. Louis County, there are 10 banks operating. Again, these are just made up numbers. Loan two, there's 6 banks operating in Franklin County. And we see that the interest rate on the loan in Franklin County is higher. Now, the question is, does this mean that JP Morgan has more market power in Franklin County versus St. Louis County? Or is loan two just riskier? And we don't actually see that there's a difference in risk across these loans. So this is kind of the fundamental empirical problem with kind of testing this. And we're going to take an approach where we're going to use a confidential regulatory data set collected by the Federal Reserve. We'll actually be able to see the riskiness of each of these loans. We'll have access to the probability of default and the loss given default for each of these loans. And so what we're going to be able to do is control for the risk of the loan. And then what we can say is, if we can compare these two loans, we can look at one bank giving 2 loans at the same time with the same characteristics and the same risk. And we can say if one has a higher interest rate, this is probably due to market power. So throughout this paper, this is kind of the experiment that we're going to be doing throughout the paper, if you get lost at any point with my jargon. Okay. So what do we find? We are going to estimate a loan level measure of markup, which is supposed to reflect market power, by controlling for banks' private risk assessment, so the probability of default and loss given default of each loan. And we'll show that this markup is unrelated to the future performance of loans. So this is really not related to the actual risk. It's not going to have this problem that I just showed you before when we just look at differences in interest rates of loans across regions. And critically, if we don't control for the risk of the loan, I'll show you that when you estimate markup, this will strongly predict future performance. So what we're going to argue is you really need to know the risk of the loan if you want to measure market power in loan markets. And then what we'll find is actually in regions with more banks, we're actually going to see higher markups. This is kind of consistent with this adverse selection channel. And then we'll also provide more evidence of this channel. We'll show you that when markups are higher for firms that stay with their existing banks. This is kind of a classic information holdup problem in banking. I'll kind of discuss it more later. And second, we'll show that markups will drop following a shock that reduces asymmetric information in local loan markets. Let me just kind of dive right into the data that the methodology and the data that we're using. Oh, something weird, I guess, happened with the slides, but don't worry about it. Okay, so if we take the interest rate of a loan, we can decompose that into the marginal cost of that loan and the markup. Now, there are numerous things that go into the marginal cost, but I would argue the key thing is the risk of that borrower. That's the main cost that the bank is bearing that gets reflected in the interest rate. And so what's left over is the markup, which is due to the market power of the bank. So what we're going to do, and we go into much more details in the paper, but I spare some of the methodology here, is we're going to do a predictive regression with interest rate on the left-hand side and loan controls and these internal assessments of the risk of the loan. And what we'll do is we'll create a base, we'll estimate this marginal cost using this predictive regression. And we'll also do the same where we don't control for the private information of the risk of the loan. And we'll define markup just like in this just like in this identity here, we'll define markup as the interest rate minus this estimated marginal cost of the loan that incorporates the riskiness of that loan. And if this measure of markup is truly measuring market power, it should not be related to the risk of the loan. And we're going to directly test this by regressing the future performance of the loan on our measure of markup. Okay, so what's the data? This is Federal Reserve Y14Q data on corporate loans over $1 million. The Fed began collecting this data after the financial crisis to monitor and perform stress tests. And so we have very detailed loan characteristics and performance and firm financials for all these loans. But most importantly for our analysis is we have these internal risk assessments of probability of default and loss given default. And the directions for these firms is that they have to basically come up with their best measure of these risk assessments. So this is for US bank holding companies with over 50 billion in assets. So these are larger banks. We have a quarterly sample from the end of 2014 to 2020. And we restrict the sample to new loans because we're interested in the markup that the bank charges on the initial loan. And we also remove publicly traded firms and syndicated loans where we might expect kind of these local market power effects to be less prevalent. Here's some summary statistics. I mean, the average loan size is only $7 million. So while these aren't small businesses, these are actually fairly small companies. The average assets is 100 million. So these aren't large corporations in our data. And what I've done here is I've plotted, I place loans into interest rate buckets. So left to right is higher interest rates. And on the y-axis, we have the average realized default rate in these buckets. What you can see is, as you might expect, as the interest rate gets higher, average default rates go up. Although it might not be as strong as you might expect. If you go from the first bucket to the second bucket, actually this default rate goes down. Now, if we do the same exact thing, but place loans into probability of default buckets, we see a much stronger relationship with realized default. So what I think this suggests, and we'll show more formally, is there may be some component of the interest rate that's not related to the risk of the loan. And that's exactly what we want to analyze in this paper. I'm going to go through this a little bit quickly because I don't have so much time, but when we do indeed control for the risk of the loan in estimating markup, we find that this measure of markup does not predict future performance. Well, if we do the same, so this, I think, provides some validity to our measure of markup, that this isn't contaminated by the risk of the borrower. Now, in contrast, if we estimate markup without this private information of the banks, we see that this markup strongly predicts future loan performance. And so what I think this suggests is banks have, I mean, and this may be obvious, banks have some private soft information that's being reflected in their risk assessments that we don't necessarily see in the interest rate. This is kind of the main table and the only actual table I'll show you, but this is just showing you if we look at the number of banks, the relationship between the number of banks and markups, you can just think of markups as the interest rate after we control for the risk of the loan. We see this positive relationship, which is maybe kind of flies in the face of your normal intuition. Now you may wonder, well, what if there's just one bank in town? If there's one bank, truly you would not have this effect. And you'd be right, because they're a monopoly. We see that while on average the effect is positive, adding more banks, if there truly is a single bank in the market, markups are also higher. We show this effect persists if we include different controls and firm characteristics. We add information about the county, population density, average wages. We still have this positive relationship between markups and the number of banks. And actually, maybe this will be an easier way to look at this. We're placing loans into number of bank buckets here. And you can see when there's one bank, this is kind of like a monopoly, markups are high. It drops from 1 to 2, but then it starts going up again, which is consistent with this kind of adverse selection story, where as you add more banks to the market, this adverse selection problem becomes more severe, and markups and the market power of the banks is actually increasing. So that's our main result. Now we want to ask about the channel. So a common theme of these kind of models is this kind of information holdup problem. When a firm borrows from a bank, that bank collects information over time. This actually can give that bank market power over that firm. And so what we do is we restrict the analysis to firms with multiple loans in the sample. And we see, indeed, if those firms stay with their existing banks, are those markups higher? And we find evidence consistent with that. And the idea of this, again, is if I were to leave my bank, other banks would assume I was rejected because something's going wrong. This actually gives market power to that bank. Last thing we do, so we want to have something, we really want to have something that kind of changes the asymmetric information in the area to really nail down this channel. So we use these capital surcharges that were imposed on globally systemic important banks, or GSIBs, in 2016 as a shock to asymmetric information. There's a JFE paper showing that following the imposition of these surcharges, these large banks reduce their lending relative to other banks. And so what we argue is that this forced reduction in lending reduces the asymmetric information problem in local markets. The basic idea is if some person walks into my door, I now know that they probably were not rejected by one of these banks because they were a bad borrower. They were more likely rejected because those banks have to just cut back their lending. So it's less of a bad signal. And so we find that indeed in these local markets in 2016, market share of these large banks, it drops following the imposition of these surcharges. And then we also see a drop in markups following this imposition of the surcharges. So consistent with our hypothesis that this cutback in lending reduces the asymmetric information problem, we indeed see that markups drop following the imposition of these surcharges. We also find that these effects are concentrated among borrowers who stay with their existing banks. And then we also see larger effects in counties with higher initial aggregate GSIB market share presence or market shares. Okay, so to conclude, in corporate loan markets, markups are actually lower in more concentrated local markets. That's the argument of this paper. We think we do a reasonable job of showing that. And the key innovation is that we estimate markup by actually controlling for banks' private information or the risk of that loan. And we show in this paper, without doing that, this is really key, because if you don't do that, often the interest rate is going to contain some component of the bank's private information. And so we think evidence is consistent with adverse selection driving market power in local banking markets. I think it's not going forward, but oh, okay. Oh, okay, never mind. Okay, so maybe coming back to then Governor Bowman's keynote, we think that the standard methods for measuring market power may not be appropriate for these loan markets. First, deposit markets, they're not subject to the same degree of asymmetric information. A deposit is kind of a deposit. You're not worried about someone paying you back so much these days. And in loan markets, this higher concentration, this does not necessarily mean more market power. And so we think that we would support a more subtle approach to treating market power. And we think this methodology that we use could be useful for regulators who have access to this data. And I'll stop there.
Well, again, an amazingly accurate use of 15 minutes. Thank you.